Welcome to Behaviorally Speaking, Leadership for Changemakers, the podcast where leadership meets behavior science and where educators, clinicians, and humans grow. I'm your host, Dr. Esther Bubb, and every week we'll explore the small, powerful behaviors that strengthen teams, inspire people, and create meaningful change. Whether you're leading a classroom, a team, a family, or simply leading yourself, this show is for you. Let's grow together, one intentional behavior at a time. Today's episode is titled The Science of Motivation and the Heart of Leadership. If you've ever wondered why some environments inspire people to show up and others not so much, you are not alone. Leaders often talk about motivating people, but true motivation isn't magic. It's not about personality, it's about design. And today's guest is someone whose career embodies that intersection of science, advocacy, and heart. Today, I'm honored to welcome Tracey Wise, an extraordinary educational administrative leader, trauma-informed trainer, and special education law and compliance expert whose work spans people services, mental health supports, crisis responses, and systems-level improvement. Tracey is known for her ability to lead with clarity under pressure, creating safety in times of crisis, and advocating fiercely for both students and adults. Her leadership is grounded in humanity, equity, and behavioral understanding, which makes her the perfect guest for this conversation on motivation and leadership. Tracey, thank you so much for being here. I've really been looking forward to our conversation. But before we dive in, how are you feeling coming into tonight's episode?
I'm feeling grounded and I think pretty excited. Conversations like this matter, especially right now when leaders, educational leaders are navigating so much complexity. So I really feel grateful for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. I love that, Tracey, and I really thank you for sharing that. It's always great to hear where you're at before we dive in, because I really think that perspective is going to make this conversation even more meaningful. So let's jump right in, right? There's so much I'm excited to explore with you tonight. So, Tracey, you've had such a rich leadership journey: pupil services, intermediate unit leadership, special education law, trauma-informed training, and mental health support. So can you share how your path shaped the leader you are today?
I think my path was shaped less by the titles and more by the proximity to students that I served, especially students with complex needs, staff under pressure, during COVID, and systems that didn't always flex when people needed them to. So, serving as a teacher, administrator, consultant across every role, I learned that leadership isn't really about control. It's about the conditions that you're in at that moment. So my experiences really taught me not to ask, why isn't a person motivated, but what's happening in the environment that's making that motivation so hard right now.
Wonderful. I really love that. And I'm really happy that you brought up the word COVID, because Tracey, I have always admired, right, how you show up during moments of crisis.
Mm-hmm.
So moments when clarity and compassion really matter. So can you talk a bit about how your experiences with supporting staff during crises shaped your approach to supporting both adults and students?
Crises stripped away illusions that motivation comes from incentives or pressure. What I saw, showing up to various crises over and over was that people really don't disengage because they don't care. They start to disengage because they're overwhelmed, they're dysregulated, or they're unsupported. And that's a big one. That understanding fundamentally shape my leadership. So I approach both adults and students through the same lens: safety first, clarity second, growth third. And we know that, we all go back to that analogy about being on an airplane and you have to give yourself oxygen first.
Wonderful. Tracey, you mentioned, overwhelmed versus dysregulated. That is such a powerful statement, but really shows how powerful your journey has been as a leader. I really love how your experiences shaped not just your approach to leadership, but also the way you connect with people. In everything you just shared, it really shows how you are connected with the people you serve. And I really believe it speaks to the heart behind the work you do. So on that note, Tracey, what do you believe has been the most defining moment for you as a leader?
I think one defining moment was realizing that my job wasn't to fix people, but to unintentionally help, them stop harming through unrealistic expectations or rigid systems. So when I shifted my thought process from managing behavior to really looking at environments and managing the environment, I feel like that really changed how I became. So outcomes, trust, sustainability, and building systems.
Wonderful. I love that. So that is such an incredible explanation. You talked about your role. You've discovered your role is not to fix people, right? And you began to look at behavior, right? Changing behavior versus managing people, for example. And I can see how it really shaped your perspective as a leader. It's really inspiring to hear how you turned that experience into something that drives your approach today. And I truly believe many of our listeners can relate to those turning points you just shared. So from that perspective, let's pivot the conversation to chat about motivation.
Okay.
From a behavioral lens, I believe, Tracey, that motivation as a component of behavior, right, as a behavior analyst, needs to be included in more leadership conversations and professional development activities. So having said that, how do you define motivation, especially in high stress or emotionally charged environments?
I started to look at motivation not really as willpower and something innate, but it's more about access. So access to safety, predictability, purpose. So when we find ourselves in high stress environments, that motivation becomes fragile and more fragile, day by day. And it can fluctuate, through, different situations, but leaders don't create motivation directly. Right. What we do is we start removing those barriers. We build safety, we build trust. We're removing a lot of the barriers, right, to have that.
I love that. So I heard you say, motivation is really access to safety, access to predictability, access to purpose. I really love that. That really makes sense to me. And I also believe it makes sense to our listeners. So building on your definition of motivation, right, and your most defining moment as a leader, which you described earlier, how do you see your defining moment and your definition of motivation influencing the way you motivate and support your team now?
I keep from personalizing that disengagement. When someone's struggling or that disengagement, whether it's an adult or a student, I don't see resistance. I see information, and looking at that why. So it allows me to respond more with curiosity and asking those questions instead of trying to correct someone and fix it. And so that, is far more effective and you see long-term goals.
Yeah, I love that, Tracey. You see information versus resistance, and it builds your curiosity. So it makes me wonder, Tracey, what impact have you seen on your team as an outcome of leading this way?
I've seen a lot of increased trust, reduced burnout, teams that recover faster after hard moments. Yeah. So people will take risks again. There's a behavior, and you show up, you're supportive. The team afterwards, discusses it. Right. The next time they're going to take a risk again. They're going to, try something because you were there. You speak honestly. Yeah. So people stay, they feel seen, they feel heard.
Wonderful. I really love that. You talked about trust. You talked about fast recovery. You talked about they show up again and they support, right? So the idea that motivation is about those things and not their character per se is huge because
Hmm.
leaders often attribute disengagement to personality or attitude, but behaviorally speaking, with all of the examples you gave, motivation is really shaped by reinforcement history. That's why they show up. They continue to show up, right? The
Right.
predictability and the antecedent management, like the rewarding structures and routines that you create for your staff, the clear directions and expectations you provide, and working environments that are safe, which you also mentioned, Tracey, that they're safe physically and emotionally. So in addition to the factors I just listed, in your professional leadership, you talk about how trauma and chronic stress affect motivation. So based on your experience, what can leaders observe, right, that could provide cues to them about staff motivation in relation to trauma, in relation to stress, or in relation to crises? So in other words, what are some behaviors you have observed from your staff that signal to you that the work environment is not motivating to them?
I think you start to see withdrawal,
Mm,
that irritability, maybe,
okay.
a teacher or staff member or, whatever area you're leading, irritability,
Yeah.
rigidity, missed deadlines. You don't see that creativity anymore.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
You're going to see, that absenteeism is going to go up. Whereas
Mm,
when you're leading the other way, you're going to see that go down. Or you might see like lack of compliance with engagement. When you're
okay.
leading, they're not, those conversations aren't happening. People aren't asking questions.
Mm-hmm.
And none of this none of these are character flaws. They're stress responses, period.
Wonderful. So I heard words like or behavior such as withdrawal and seeing signs of irritability. So when you notice those cues, Tracey, what steps do you take to re-engage and support your team?
I try to slow down, which is very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Take a step back,
Yeah.
clarify expectations, not only for staff, but for myself. What are my expectations? Ask open questions. Am I missing something?
Yeah.
My staff are, on the front line, so to say, at all different levels. So am I missing something as a leader? And reducing some unnecessary demands whenever and wherever possible. And just like we are in the classroom,
Mm-hmm.
really increase predictability.
Wonderful. You gave specific examples, specific behavioral responses such as slowing down, clarifying expectations, right? Those are steps, Tracey, that really show your thoughtful and proactive approach to leadership. It's really clear to me that, you're not just addressing the immediate challenges, but creating an environment, right? And really thinking it through really thoughtfully where the people you support, they feel seen, they feel heard, right? And they feel like, you're on this path with them together. So, let's chat a bit about leadership behaviors that boost motivation intrinsically. So as you know from your wealth of experience, intrinsic, motivation really focuses on doing something for external rewards, right? So in the work
Right,
context, an example would be working for the paycheck, right?
right.
But on the contrary, intrinsic motivation really focuses on doing something for internal satisfaction. It's just satisfying to us in and of itself, right? So I'd like to focus our conversation in this segment on intrinsic motivation. So in the work context, an example of intrinsic motivation for me is like fostering growth, which is something that motivates me, Tracey, daily. So
Right.
like seeing staff, students, colleagues like yourself, families, and the individuals I interact with, every day grow and move from where they are to where they could be. It's really something that's really important to me. So
Yes,
just
yes.
just like the metamorphosis of a butterfly, growth is really a really transformative process. So something
Hmm.
sometimes you don't see that first, Tracey, but if we really look ultimately, it leads to something extraordinary in the people we support and in ourselves. So as leaders, creating those conditions for that kind of transformation is one of the most rewarding parts of our work. And I believe you'll agree. So staff who are intrinsically motivated, like you said earlier, show up. They show up to work
Hmm.
and they support each other because that work environment is personally rewarding to them, because they are driven by internal satisfaction, because they are focused on their well-being, the
Hmm.
well-being of their colleagues, their autonomy and their purpose. And you also talked about purpose earlier, right? So on that note, Tracey, what intrinsic motivators drive you, Tracey, to continue to show up to work daily?
It's not always easy, at,
Yeah,
4:35 a.m. But,
yeah,
I feel like there's purpose and there's impact and
mm,
integrity and like that
yeah,
purpose and that
yeah.
impact can go
Yeah.
so far. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's not just that immediate to like the one student or one teacher or 20 or
Yeah.
30 or 50, you know, that
Mm-hmm.
person tells somebody or, you know, you teach
Yeah.
somebody. So that impact is huge. Knowing my work reduces harm, creates opportunity, helps all people feel safer. I mean, it just,
Yeah.
I keep showing up.
Yeah. I
Like,
love
why
that.
not? Yeah. Why
Right,
not?
exactly, exactly. You talked about purpose, impact, integrity. I'm really loving this conversation so far. Um, and then what really stood out to me, you said, knowing my work reduces harm, right? That is such a phenomenal point, Tracy. It really shows how authentic leadership can ripple through a team, like from the leader and to everyone on the
Mm-hmm.
team when motivation comes from within. And just from this conversation, I can tell you're just like internally and intrinsically motivated to do what you do. And because you have that authentic motivation and drive, it really creates a culture that feels genuine and empowering to your staff, to your colleagues, perhaps even to your supervisor and to those that you support. So I believe it's something that so many leaders strive for in today's world of leadership. And everything you said so far demonstrates, that you have some of those capabilities, in
I
your
hope so.
toolbox. Yeah. In your toolbox that, that allows you to support
Yeah.
those that you lead. So can you share a moment, Tracy, where understanding a staff member's intrinsic motivators or values shifted how you supported them, or perhaps even challenged you to adapt your approach to supporting their motivation?
I think, I once worked with a staff member who appeared disengaged,
Okay.
but was deeply like values driven around student
Mm,
dignity, which is huge,
okay.
and
Yeah.
especially with complex students and behaviors. So once I aligned that feedback and expectations to the value instead of compliance and making sure, not rules are
Right.
followed, of course, but just
Right.
every I and T, their performance and confidence shifted dramatically. So just making that connection with the individual, about their specific values allowed me to understand where they were coming from so I can just shift my lens a little.
Wonderful. So you said, this example, the person was disengaged, but you realized they were values driven around student dignity, and then you made that connection, right? And that allowed you to shift your approach. And I believe that's such a powerful example. It shows the importance of listening deeply, but knowing our staff, right? And then being
Hmm.
willing to adjust as a leader, just as you shared in that example. And I believe that understanding what truly matters to someone can completely change the dynamic and strengthen the trust between leaders and their staff. So, building on that, what advice would you give to leaders who are trying to tap into their own intrinsic motivation?
Like reconnect, like
Mm,
take a step back and reconnect to the impact, not
mm,
necessarily the outcome, but
right.
like what is the impact? And I ask myself a lot, like who am I helping?
Yeah.
And what harm am I preventing? Am I helping the student right now? Am I helping the teacher? Who needs
Yeah.
this?
Yeah.
And what harm, am I ultimately preventing? And I give myself permission to evolve. Like that's the goal.
Mm,
Lifelong learners.
right.
And motivation changes over time. It's not set in stone.
Yeah.
You have ups and downs and it's fluid.
Mm, that's wonderful. Key takeaways for me from what you just said. Reconnect to the impact. Who am I
Yes.
helping? What harm am I preventing? And you give yourself permission to involve. I love that. That is such valuable advice, Tracy. I think it really underscores how leadership starts from within, right? Just as you're
Hmm.
describing. When leaders take the time to understand what truly drives them, but also what drives their staff, it creates a ripple effect throughout the organization. So I really love that
Yes.
perspective you shared. But before we wrap up this segment, let's talk about identifying staff's intrinsic motivators. One practice I maintain, Tracy, whenever I begin a new position or I have new staff under me, is to schedule like an initial brief informal one-on-one meeting to begin to learn
Right.
more about them, right? So one of the questions I always ask them is about their motivators, not only at work, but I also ask them, about outside of work. So like even, recently I've been asking staff, so tell me something you enjoy doing, outside of work.
Right.
And, it in those conversations, I begin to learn more about what's important to them, and they also get to know a bit about me. So, is there a strategy you use with your staff to identify what motivates them intrinsically that you are willing to share with our listeners that they can implement?
I think really thinking about value-based questions. So when you're, having those conversations with staff, having that discussion, what part of your work feels most meaningful? What drains you the least? When do you feel most effective? Really kind of get to know them, and then you listen. Like, you're not offering a fix.
Yeah.
You're just listening, because what they're saying, those things are going to happen, and most of it is not fixable per se.
Right.
And they know that.
Yeah. I love that. Values-based questions and listen. Yeah. That's such a great takeaway. It's simple, it's actionable, and it's really something leaders can start doing right away. And I believe that's going to resonate with a lot of the people listening. So thank you for sharing that insight. It really ties together everything we've talked about in this segment. And as we end this segment, I want to focus our thoughts and those of our listeners on purposeful motivation. So Viola Davis once said, "Your purpose is not what you do. It's what happens to people when you do what you do." And sometimes that person is you. So I'm going to say it one more time. Viola Davis once said, "Your purpose is not what you do. It's what happens to people when you do what you do. And sometimes that person is you." So this makes me think that when our work is aligned with our purpose, as you said earlier, we are driven to learn what motivates our staff intrinsically to ensure that they are motivated, and then to ensure that we're providing diverse opportunities for them to contact those contingencies that would allow them to access their motivators. So when the work we do aligns with our purpose and our intrinsic motivators, meaningful transformative growth occurs, not only in the lives of those we interact with, but also in our own lives. So with those thoughts in mind, let's shift the conversation to trauma-informed motivation as a core component of the heart of leadership. I know that that's your thing, trauma-informed care. So given that your work, Tracey, is deeply trauma-informed, how does trauma or even chronic stress change a person's motivational capacity?
Trauma really narrows that focus, and it shifts the brain into survival mode. It really, that amygdala is, really rapid. So motivation doesn't disappear. It kind of becomes inaccessible. It's really pushed down. So leaders really need to then widen the environment before expecting effort, because you're not going to see that effort.
Okay, wonderful. I really love that. Trauma narrows the focus. Motivation doesn't disappear. I am thankful for that explanation, Tracey. It's very helpful. So then on that note, for leaders who are working with teams who are overwhelmed, they're fatigued, they're navigating transitions such as, student transitions, staff transitions, supervisory, administrative, even organizational transitions, what does it look like to motivate with empathy, Tracey, while at the same time maintaining professional boundaries?
It's compassion without rescuing. We're not rescuing, just like, I said earlier, you're not trying to fix it,
Right.
Trauma, and stress are unfortunately part of life. I think it's, how we as leaders really go about it. And again, taking steps back. So, I'll say it again, we're not rescuing, we're supporting without over functioning. We're setting clear expectations, and we're delivering those expectations with humanity.
That's so powerful. Compassion without rescuing. And the buzzword for me from everything you just said in response to that question is humanity.
Yes.
So, yeah. So, your experience with trauma informed care is really shining through in your responses. So what has helped you, Tracey, remain focused and motivated despite challenges, right? And what really inspires you to continue to lead with motivational empathy?
I think really self-reflecting a lot. I'm not perfect by any means, and I want to, keep learning, setting boundaries, which I have to remember, quite often. And remember that leadership is a long game. It's not, we're not in, a short sprint. So I don't need to win every moment. I need to build systems, build sustainability, to keep it going.
I love that. You're sharing so many wonderful nuggets.
Oh, I'm glad.
Yeah, it's a long game. It's not a short sprint. I love that. I really, really love that. That's going to be my biggest takeaway, I think, so far for today. Yeah. it's really motivating and it's encouraging. It's really a strong reminder, and it's such an inspiring perspective. It really shows how resilience and intentionality, I'm sorry, such as yours, can help keep a leader grounded even in tough
Yes,
seasons, right?
yes.
So I believe, Tracy, that so many people listening will appreciate that reminder. As you've said, that motivation really isn't just about energy, it's really about purpose, right? So as we wrap up this segment and we prepare to move into our closing thoughts, based on the sum of your wealth of professional experiences, how do you see this approach that you just shared shaping the future of your leadership?
Um, it keeps me adaptable. As
Mm,
systems change, people remain human.
yeah.
And that's the thing, and I said it before, being human, humanity. People remain human. And so that lens is going to always guide my work.
I like that. Adaptable and people remain human. It's such an inspiring vision, Tracy. I really love how intentional you are about carrying this forward. And again, it really shows the depth of your commitment to leading with empathy and purpose. Um, and it's really a perfect way to wrap up this segment. And I believe it sets the stage beautifully for what we'll discuss next. So let's keep moving as we wrap up our conversation during this final segment. Can you share a real world moment when staff motivation or even your motivation or the motivation of a colleague shifted, not because someone necessarily pushed harder, but because the environment changed? Maybe a moment where a staff member or a student re-engaged or a team aligned around the needs rather than around blame. Or maybe even you shifted your approach or you discovered a new approach to motivating those that you lead, or maybe even yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I ran a program where when I walked in, it was not the program that when I left. And I've seen staff
Mm,
re-engage when blame was replaced with clarity, when schedules became predictable,
yeah.
when leadership acknowledged strain instead of ignoring it,
Mm,
acknowledging what we're all sitting in. Motivation followed. Not
yeah.
because pressure increased, not because the hand came down, but because
Mm-hmm.
safety did. That safety increased, that trust increased, that
Mm,
humanity increased, and
I
listening.
love and
Yeah,
listening. So safety, trust, humanity, and listening. And I heard you say the program you walked out of was not the program you walked into, right? So that's
right.
real. Yeah, that's transformation right there. So how do you keep that mindset, right? That transformative mindset front and center as you continue to lead through change and keep yourself motivated, your staff, your colleagues motivated in your current and your, future professional experiences and environments?
I keep asking myself, like, is this a people problem or is it a system problem?
Mm.
And that question alone changes everything. And what road you go.
Okay, wonderful. Is it people problem or system problem?
Yeah,
It's really
that's it.
spiritual. Yeah. I love that. It's a powerful way to enter a conversation. Again, I love how intentional and forward thinking your approach is. It really reinforces the idea, as you said, when you talked about it's a long game as opposed to a short sprint, right? The
Hmm.
idea that leadership is a continuous journey, not just a destination, right? It's a
Yes.
practice. We learn and we improve daily and we reflect, as you said, and we're like, what can I do better? What can I change?
Hmm.
Thank you so much for sharing those insights. I truly believe they're going to resonate with so many leaders who are navigating change and really striving to stay grounded in purpose. So before we wrap up, what are three strategies you want leaders to walk away with, Tracy? Things that can help them engineer motivation in themselves and those that they lead instead of just simply sitting back and hoping for it to occur?
Um, engineer safety before effort.
Mm,
I can't stress that enough that,
yeah.
safety is the number one for everyone, students,
Mm-hmm.
staff. Um, treat disengagement as data, no matter who's disengaged. Look at that as a
Mm,
data point also.
yeah.
And design motivating environments,
Mm,
engineer that environment. We do it for the students, do it for, the staff and the building, the program, wherever you are
yeah.
is huge.
Wonderful. So safety before effort. Treat
Yes.
disengagement as data
Yes.
and design motivating environments. Tracy, those
Absolutely.
strategies are such a gift for leaders. They're practical. They're
Yes.
practical, they're actionable, and they're rooted in real experience, right? I can tell you're really, leaning on your experiences here in the conversation, right? And, I really love how they shift the focus from hoping for motivation to actually creating and nourishing it. Like you said, design motivating environments, right? So thank you again for sharing those insights. They're the perfect way, Tracey, to wrap up this segment and, set us up for the call to action. And for me, the heart-centered reminder here from everything you said tonight is that motivation isn't magic. It's design. I just heard you say design motivating environments, right? It's science, and it's strengthened through intentional motivation-focused behaviors, such as all the ones you shared tonight. And leaders can create motivating conditions that either spark or suppress their potential and potential of those that they lead. So they have to make a choice. Am I going to spark or am I going to suppress, right?
That's right. Choice, yep.
Yeah, and Tracey, you're all about sparking their potential. I heard you say the program you walked into was not the same. It was better when you walked out of it. So that's wonderful.
Absolutely.
That's phenomenal.
Thank you.
So thank you again for joining me for this very uplifting conversation. I'm grateful to you for sharing your wisdom, your experience, and most of all, Tracey, your heart. I can tell your heart was in this conversation. Your leadership makes such a difference, not just for students and families, but for colleagues as myself and, for educators navigating incredibly complex and challenging environments like yourself. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Wonderful. Thank you. To our listeners, thank you for joining today's conversation on Behaviorally Speaking, Leadership for Changemakers. If today's episode inspired you, share it with someone who leads, teaches, or influences others. Remember to follow the show and leave a review. It helps us reach more changemakers like you. And whatever or wherever you celebrate, happy holidays to you. We will return with episode 5 in January 2026. Until then, whether you're leading a classroom, a school, a team, a program, or even a community, keep leading with clarity, compassion, and purpose.